Welcome to the deep dive on VSOW. This is where we take complex, often, contradictory source material lectures, policy papers, public comments, and we try to synthesize it into essential knowledge for you.
And today, we're diving headfirst into probably one of the most polarizing questions out there in modern economics and, frankly, global politics.
That's right. We're talking about the steep and accelerating concentration of wealth, the existence of billionaires that results from that, and maybe most fundamentally, how should we tax them?
Or should we?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and our job today really is to give you the full picture, the factual context behind this whole argument. It's complex.
Definitely. We've pulled together sources from, well, all over the map. Technical proposals from leading economists like Gabriel Zucman, who's really focused on fixing what he sees as a broken tax system.
All the way to philosophical defenses. Arguments that say extreme wealth isn't a problem, it's actually the engine of innovation and prosperity in our society. So, quite the range. Our mission here is pretty critical because the facts, well, they show a clear conflict, don't they? Over the last few decades, you've seen this extraordinary surge in global billionaire wealth.
Huge surge. And matched by evidence that these wealthiest individuals often pay surprisingly low effective tax rates, like really low.
So we need to understand how this is happening. What are the proposed solutions? And crucially, what are the trade-offs if we decide to, intervene more aggressively?
We'll spend a good chunk of time unpacking Zucman's arguments for a global minimum tax. That's a big one.
And contrast that.
Contrast it sharply with the defense side, the idea that private capital, especially when allocated by billionaires, might actually be better, more efficient than public spending.
And finally,
we'll look at the data, the hard data that seems to link this extreme wealth concentration directly to, well, less social mobility, fewer educational opportunities for the average person. So it's got real-world consequences.
Okay, let's start there then. Section 1, the problem itself. The extreme concentration of wealth and these low effective tax rates.
Right. So the scale. It's important to grasp just how significant this shift has been. It's not just, the rich getting a bit richer.
No, it feels more structural, like it changes the power dynamics. Zucman's research, and he's been tracking this global billionaire class, about 3,000 families worldwide. For decades, it paints a really stark picture.
It really does. If you look back, say, to 1987, the collective wealth of these billionaires was equivalent to about 3% of world GDP.
3%, okay.
Which was already significant, right? But compare that to today. Now, their wealth sits at around 14% of global GDP.
14%? Wow, that's more than quadrupled relative to the world economy.
Exactly. That's why you hear economists talking about a second Gilded Age. But the concentration levels now, they argue, are actually far more severe than the first time around.
And the growth rates behind that must be pretty telling.
Oh, absolutely. Over nearly 40 years, the average wealth of these billionaires grew, get this, 7.1% per year, and that's after inflation.
7.1% year-on-year net of inflation.
Meanwhile, the average adult, globally, their wealth grew at less than half that pace, just 3.2% per year.
That difference, that compounding difference over decades, that's where the concentration really explodes from.
And that's the key to the political side of it, too. Zucman puts it very plainly. Wealth is power.
Simple as that.
When wealth concentrates this fast, power concentrates, too. The power to influence policy, politics, even ideology. It's not just about buying things. It's about shaping the rules of the game.
Bending regulations, setting priorities.
Exactly. Priorities that tend to favor, well, the interests of this tiny, hyper-wealthy group.
Okay, so that's the scale. Now, the part that gets really counterintuitive, the tax system, how it seems to fail right at the top. We hear the super rich pay taxes, but the effective rate.
The effective rate. That's the total tax paid relative to their actual wealth increase. And the number is, frankly, shocking. Globally, billionaires pay an estimated effective tax rate of only about 0.2% of their total wealth.
0.2%. It's almost hard to picture how small that is.
It is. Think about it like this. A nurse, a teacher, maybe making $60,000 a year. They might pay, 25% of their income in various taxes, federal, state, local, payroll.
Right. Easily.
But for most middle-class people, their income is basically their wealth accumulation for the year. So that 25% of income is a huge chunk relative to their total wealth growth, way, way higher than 0.2%.
So the system is meant to be progressive, right?
Yeah.
Higher income, higher rate.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's this glitch at the very peak.
That's what the research shows. If you model the entire U.S. system, all taxes included, it mostly acts like a big flat tax for the vast majority, somewhere between 25–30% effective rate.
Okay.
But right at the very, very top, there's a noticeable dip. The super rich often pay effectively less than the middle class, and it all comes down to the structure of modern wealth.
And this isn't necessarily illegal tax evasion, right? It's legal avoidance. How can someone with billions legally end up with zero taxable income?
That is the absolute core of it. It's legal avoidance built into the system's design. Our tax system is fundamentally based on taxing income. Things like salaries, wages, dividends, selling assets for a profit, realized capital gains.
Okay.
But billionaire wealth, it overwhelmingly comes from owning assets, often stock in the companies they founded that just go up in value rapidly. So they use a couple of key legal mechanisms.
Where's the first one?
First, control over their companies. They own huge chunks, so they can basically instruct the company not to pay out dividends.
So the profit stays inside the company.
Exactly. If the company keeps the profit, the billionaire hasn't technically received any taxable income, even though their share of the company is now worth more.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second mechanism?
Capital gains. This is the big one.
Right.
You only pay tax on the appreciation of an asset, like stock, when you sell it.
So if you never sell,
You never pay the tax. But you're still getting richer on paper, massively richer sometimes. And what can you do? You can borrow against those appreciated assets. Take out huge loans using your stock portfolio as collateral, often at very low interest rates.
and the loan money isn't income?
Nope. Loan proceeds aren't taxed as income, so they can live very comfortably off these loans. And then, the final kicker, when they die, those assets often pass to their heirs with something called a step-up in basis.
Step up in basis. What does that do?
It essentially wipes the slate clean for capital gains tax purposes. The cost basis of the asset gets stepped up to its market value at the time of death. So, decades of accumulated unrealized gains, poof, never taxed.
Wow. Okay. So that's how someone can have billions in wealth growth, but legally report zero or very little taxable income year after year.
Precisely. That explains the U.S. situation. But you mentioned earlier it's sometimes even easier in other places, like Europe, using holding companies.
Yes, that's a really important distinction. The U.S. actually put in some anti-avoidance rules back in the 1930s. There was a big public outcry when figures like J.P. Morgan were revealed to be paying no income tax. So some direct uses of shell companies got curbed.
But not everywhere.
Not everywhere, and not all structures. In places like France or the Netherlands, for example, a different structure is common.
Walk us through it. How does it work?
Okay, imagine billionaire Y owns operating company X. Instead of company X paying a dividend directly to billionaire Y.
Which would be taxed as personal income.
Right. Instead, company X pays the dividend to holding company Z.
And holding company Z is?
It's another company, an intermediate shell structure that billionaire Y also controls.
Ah, so the money moves from one company to another company, both controlled by the same person.
Exactly. And because the funds are moving between two corporate entities, they often stay within the corporate tax sphere. Many countries exempt these intercorporate dividends from tax.
So the money piles up inside holding company Z.
Right. And billionaire Y's personal taxable income, still legally zero, even though they control potentially billions sitting in that holding company.
So that's how you can get effective income tax rates near zero for some billionaires in those countries, even on huge sums flowing from their businesses.
Yes. And that's the kind of structural reality Zuckman points to as a major malfunction in the global tax system.
Okay, so if that's the problem, the structural bug letting assets grow untaxed while people live off loans, what's the proposed fix? Let's get into the solution Zuckman champions, the one Brazil brought to the G20.
Right, the global minimum tax on billionaires. It sounds ambitious.
It is ambitious, but the proposal itself is actually deliberately, modest in its rate. It calls for a globally coordinated minimum tax on those roughly 3,000 billionaire families worldwide.
And the rate?
The headline rate is 2%, a 2% minimum tax applied to their total wealth each year.
Why 2% specifically? Seems kind of low if you're trying to raise massive revenue.
That's the key point. The 2% wasn't chosen to maximize revenue. It was chosen very specifically to achieve tax fairness, or at least reduce unfairness.
Oh, so.
It's designed to erase that regressivity. We talked about the dip at the very top, where billionaires pay less than the middle class. Remember, the average person's wealth grows maybe 3.2% a year, and they pay a significant chunk of their income, which is often their only wealth growth, in taxes.
Okay.
Zuckman and his colleagues basically worked backwards. They calculated, what effective tax rate does the average middle-class person, that nurse or teacher, pay when you measure their total taxes against their total wealth growth?
And that calculation landed near.
It lands somewhere in the ballpark of 2% for the ultra-rich to match that burden. So the 2% isn't meant to soak the rich, it's meant to be a floor, just ensuring the wealthiest pay at least the same effective rate relative to their wealth as ordinary workers do.
So it's fundamentally about restoring progressivity, making sure the line doesn't dip down at the very top.
Exactly. It's an anti-regressivity measure, first and foremost.
Okay, but what about the impact? Is it worth the political fight just for fairness, or does it raise significant money?
Well, it does raise real money. The estimates are around $250 billion annually, globally.
$250 billion, that's not insignificant.
No, it's serious cash. For perspective, that's roughly half the estimated amount needed by developing countries just to deal with climate change adaptation and mitigation. So it could make a dent in major global challenges.
But Zipman argues the main benefit isn't even the money.
Correct. He argues the key benefit is restoring a sense of fairness, of social cohesion. When the public widely believes the system is rigged in favor of the very top, it erodes trust in democracy and public institutions. That's destabilizing.
Yeah.
So the 2% tax is partly about shoring up democratic legitimacy.
Right. Makes sense. Now let's tackle the pushback. The immediate cry you always hear is confiscation. Taxing wealth itself, not just income or transactions, is seen by opponents as an illegitimate seizure of property.
Yes, that confiscation label comes up every single time. But the counter-argument is pretty straightforward and uses the billionaires' own growth rates.
Go on.
We established their average wealth grows at 7.1% per year after inflation. If you implement a 2% tax on that wealth,
Their wealth still grows at 5.1% per year.
exactly, still growing faster than the average person's wealth, still outpacing inflation significantly, their wealth concentration would continue to increase just at a slightly slower pace.
So the argument is, it's clearly not confiscatory if their wealth is still projected to grow substantially year after year. It just shaves a bit off the top of that very high growth rate.
That's the core rebuttal. It doesn't seize existing wealth or prevent future accumulation. It just modestly reduces the rate of that accumulation.
Okay, but what about the practicalities? Implementation seems like a nightmare, especially valuing assets. You said about half of billionaire wealth is in private companies, things that aren't traded on a stock market. How do you put a fair price tag on that every year for tax purposes?
That's definitely a challenge, but proponents argue it's solvable using tools finance professionals already use every day. It requires a robust tax administration, for sure.
How would it work?
For large private companies, tax authorities would use established valuation methods. You compare the private company to similar publicly listed firms in the same sector. You look at their earnings, their assets, their cash flow, and apply standard industry multiples like price-to-earnings ratios or EBITDA multiples to estimate a fair market value.
And you'd need data.
Absolutely. You'd need to make sure that data from actual sales of private companies, like in private equity deals, is reported transparently to tax authorities. That helps benchmark the valuations.
But isn't there a huge incentive for the billionaire to lowball the valuation to minimize their tax?
There is. And Zuckman proposed a really clever mechanism to counteract that, almost an elegant solution.
What is it?
Okay, the tax administration would first calculate and propose a value for the assets, a pre-populated wealth amount. Let's say they value the billionaire's private company at $2 billion.
And the billionaire says, no way, it's only worth $1 billion.
Right. They protest the valuation is too high. The tax administration can then say, okay, we disagree. But if you genuinely believe it's only worth $1 billion, you have the option to pay your 2% tax in shares of your company valued at your claimed lower price.
Ah, so they understated the value.
The government gets shares at a bargain price. If the company really is worth $2 billion, the government just acquired shares valued at $1 billion, effectively doubling its money on that tax payment when those shares are eventually sold. It completely flips the incentive. You lowball the value, you risk giving away equity in your company cheaply.
That's actually quite brilliant. It forces an honest valuation or you pay a penalty in equity.
It neutralizes the incentive to undervalue, which is the biggest fear with wealth tax administration.
Okay, final big hurdle.
Yeah.
Tax competition. Global coordination is key, you said. But what stops billionaires in, say, France or Germany, if they implement this, from just packing their bags and moving to Monaco or the Cayman Islands or Dubai, places that won't implement the tax?
This is the perennial problem with taxing mobile capital or mobile people. You need strong guardrails, 2 layers, really.
Layer 1.
First, countries need taxation following the individual rules, sometimes called exit taxes or extended residency rules. If you got rich in Germany, Germany could say, we have the right to continue taxing your wealth based on our rules for, say, 5, 10, even 15 years after you officially move your residency elsewhere.
So moving doesn't provide an instant escape hatch.
Exactly. It reduces the immediate financial incentive to just up and leave purely for tax reasons.
And the second layer, this sounds more aggressive. Zuckman called it tariffs for billionaires.
Yeah, this is the mechanism designed to bring non-participating countries into the fold, or at least neutralize their ability to act as tax havens for this specific purpose. It uses market access as leverage.
How? Explain that. It sounds complex.
It draws a direct parallel to the global minimum corporate tax that was recently agreed upon, often called Pillar 2.
Right, the 15% minimum tax on multinationals.
With that system, if a multinational, say Apple, pays only 5% tax on its profits booked in Ireland, other countries where Apple operates, like France or Germany, can basically collect the missing 10% tax. 15% minimum minus 5% paid. They collect the difference.
Okay, so how does that apply to individual billionaires?
Let's say a coalition of countries, maybe the G20 implements the 2% minimum wealth tax. But the U.S., for example, does not join initially.
Okay.
Now, consider an American billionaire. Let's use Elon Musk, hypothetically. If the coalition countries determine his effective wealth tax rate globally is only, say, 0.5% because the U.S. doesn't have the tax.
Right.
A country like France, which is in the coalition, could say, Mr. Musk, your companies benefit greatly from selling Teslas and Starlink services in the French market. Since your global effective wealth tax rate is below our 2% minimum, we will collect the 1.5% difference, 2% minus 0.5%, directly from you, based on the portion of your wealth attributable to your French market activities.
Wow. So France would tax an American billionaire even if the U.S. government doesn't?
Yes. It's an extraterritorial collection mechanism using access to their large consumer market as the justification and leverage.
So it's not just punitive, it's strategic. It creates a strong incentive for countries like the U.S. to join the system.
Absolutely. Because if they don't, their own billionaires will end up paying the tax anyway, but the revenue will flow to other governments, the ones participating in the coalition.
It essentially says, if you want access to our markets, you play by these minimum tax rules, regardless of where your passport is from.
Precisely. It's about rewriting the rules of globalization slightly, tying market access not just to trade rules, but also to minimum standards on taxation, maybe eventually climate protection, labor rights. It's a way to combat the race to the bottom that pure capital mobility can create. Without that leverage, local or even national tax initiatives on the very wealthy are easily defeated by them simply moving.
Okay, that makes the global coordination seem much more feasible, or at least strategically possible. Let's pivot now to the more fundamental debate. This isn't just technical, it's deeply philosophical, for and against extreme wealth itself.
Right. You have these two really opposing worldviews clashing.
Let's start with the critique, the anti-billionaire stance. What's the core argument there beyond just the tax fairness issue?
The core argument is really about democracy and power. Critics argue that this level of extreme wealth concentration is just inherently corrosive to a functioning democracy.
How so?
Well, you hear it in public commentary all the time, the idea that a handful of individuals gain total say over policy, not the people, that politicians become or are perceived to become essentially servants of the billionaire class, catering to their interests over the broader public's.
And there's a moral dimension too, like the power itself is corrupting.
Yes, that argument comes up often. That no single person needs billions of dollars, and the immense power that comes with it inevitably corrupts. Critics might point to things like lobbying efforts, funding think tanks, influencing media narratives, or even perceived differences in how governments respond to different kinds of social unrest.
Like cracking down harder on protests about economic issues than other types of protests.
That's an example sometimes cited, suggesting a primary goal is defending the economic status quo that benefits the wealthy. Whether that's accurate is debatable, but it feeds the critique.
And this critique ties back to the tax structure again, right? The focus on income misses the point.
Exactly. A lot of the public anger gets directed at salaries or bonuses, but as we discussed, the vast bulk of billionaire wealth comes from asset appreciation untaxed gains. So yelling about high salaries, while maybe valid on its own terms, doesn't actually address the mechanism driving this extreme wealth concentration. Taxing income is insufficient when the income can legally be near zero.
Okay, so that's the critique. Now the defense, This is where figures like Flanagan and Fryman come in, arguing against the Scrooge McDuck view.
Right. Their core argument is that this picture of billionaires hoarding money in vaults is just fundamentally wrong. Their wealth isn't sitting idle, it's invested.
Invested where?
In the market, in companies, in stocks, bonds, startups. It's capital that's being put to productive use, funding businesses, creating jobs, developing technologies.
And the argument is that taxing this invested wealth is counterproductive.
Highly counterproductive, they argue, because taxing investment discourages investment. And it's precisely this investment, driven by the wealthy seeking returns, that fuels economic growth and benefits everyone.
How does billionaire investment benefit, say, a low-wage worker? That connection seems tenuous to some.
The argument is about productivity and prices. When investors fund companies that become more efficient, innovate, improve logistics, think Amazon or Walmart driving down retail costs, or pharma companies developing new drugs, they make goods and services cheaper for everyone.
So saving $1 on groceries because of supply chain efficiencies funded by investors is like a small wage increase for the consumer.
Functionally, yes. They argue investors, by increasing overall productivity, make everybody else's pieces bigger. The pie grows, and even if the billionaire gets a large new slice, the existing slices also get larger in real terms because of lower prices and new products.
And they point to specific examples of innovation driven by private capital.
Absolutely. Things like the rapid development of COVID vaccines, the sophisticated logistics we rely on daily, even basic research in really capital-intensive, long-shot fields like private space exploration. These things require vast sums of private risk-taking capital.
And they have that statistic about innovators only capturing a small fraction of the value they create.
Yes, the Nordhaus estimate. That innovators, on average, capture only about 2.2% of the total social surplus generated by their innovations. Society as a whole benefits vastly more than the innovator does personally, even if the innovator becomes a billionaire.
2.2%. That's a striking number. But it begs the question. If they only capture 2.2%, why do they need billions? Wouldn't the prospect of capturing, say, $500 million be enough incentive? Couldn't we tax the rest way above that?
That really gets to the heart of the defense. The argument against caps or very high wealth taxes centers on risk and scale.
Explain that.
For truly transformative, paradigm-shifting technologies, think fusion power, curing aging, artificial general intelligence, the upfront investment is astronomical, the risk of complete failure is incredibly high, and the time horizon is decades long.
Okay.
The argument is you need the prospect of an equally astronomical reward, potentially billions, to entice anyone to take that kind of massive long-term risk. If you cap the upside or heavily tax the wealth accumulated from past successes, the first thing that dries up isn't the yachts and private jets.
It's the funding for the next big risky bet.
Exactly. It's the moonshot capital. Taxing away this productive wealth, they argue, might feel fair in the short term, but it inadvertently throttles the engine of future breakthroughs that could benefit humanity enormously.
Which leads directly to the next big question. Who spends money better? The government with tax revenue or the altruistic billionaire with their foundation?
Yeah, the accountability question. Opponents of high wealth taxes often argue that governments are actually quite bad at allocating resources efficiently, especially towards the most pressing needs.
Why they say that?
Political incentives. Public officials need to get reelected. Tax revenue often gets funneled towards broad-based, politically popular programs, entitlement programs for the middle class, defense spending rather than targeted, potentially risky investments in, say, poverty reduction or speculative climate tech.
They mentioned a statistic about the U.S. budget.
Right, that only about 10% of the U.S. federal budget goes to means-tested programs directly targeted at the poor. The rest goes elsewhere. Politicians might not be well incentivized to take big bets on behalf of the poor or on very long-term problems.
Whereas a billionaire philanthropist
Can operate outside those political constraints. They don't need voter approval. They can decide, I think radical life extension research is the most important thing, or I want to fund efforts to prevent asteroid impacts, and just do it.
They can take risks the public sector can't or won't.
Exactly. They can experiment with potentially high-impact but unconventional projects that would never survive a legislative budget process. Think of funding for things like the SCNS Research Foundation working on regenerative medicine or long-term pandemic preparedness funds.
Okay, but accountability still feels like an issue.
Yeah.
Are billionaires really accountable? Flanagan and Fryman made a counterintuitive argument here too, didn't they? That corporate leaders might be more accountable than politicians.
It sounds strange at first. given corporate scandals and influence, but their argument focuses on different types of accountability.
Go on.
They argue corporate leaders face constant, immediate accountability from several sources, consumers voting with their dollars every single day.
If people don't like your product or practices, they buy from a competitor.
Right. Then there's the stock market, providing instant feedback on performance and future prospects, and intense public and media scrutiny. A CEO makes a big mistake, the stock tanks, the board can fire them relatively quickly.
Compared to politicians.
Politicians, especially in safe seats or gerrymandered districts, can often be insulated from direct consequences for years, sometimes decades. Their re-election might depend more on party affiliation or national trends than on their actual performance in addressing local poverty or long-term challenges. So the argument is that market mechanisms, while imperfect, can sometimes provide faster and more direct accountability than political mechanisms.
Interesting perspective. Let's shift gears slightly. We've talked philosophy and economics, now let's look at the sociological consequences. Specifically, this link between wealth inequality and social mobility, particularly via education.
Yes, this is where the data gets quite compelling. Research like that from the Urban Institute shows a really strong link. It's not just about family income during the college years, it's about family wealth.
Wealth, meaning accumulated assets, savings, property, not just the annual paycheck.
Exactly, and that distinction is crucial. Income helps you pay the bills month to month. Wealth provides a buffer, a safety net, a level of background security.
And its security matters for education how?
It provides psychological stability. If you're a student from a family with some wealth, maybe you don't have to work 30 hours a week during term time. Maybe an unexpected car repair or a medical bill doesn't force you to drop out for a semester. You can actually focus on your studies.
That makes intuitive sense. What do the numbers show?
The numbers are stark. They looked at young people from high-wealth families, the top quartile, so over $223,000 in family wealth back in 2013 dollars. Those kids had a 70% chance of completing at least 2 years of college by age 25.
70%. And for low-wealth families?
The bottom quartile, less than $2,000 in family wealth, so virtually no safety net. Their chance of completing 2 years of college was only 41%.
Wow, a nearly 30 percentage point gap. That's huge. Linked directly to wealth, not just income or ability.
The analysis controls for other factors, and it gets even clearer when you look at upward mobility. For first-generation college students, kids whose parents didn't have a degree, those from high-wealth backgrounds were roughly twice as likely to succeed in college and achieve upward mobility compared to similar students from low-wealth backgrounds.
So family wealth acts like a springboard, or maybe a safety trampoline, for educational success, especially for those starting further behind.
Precisely. It confirms that wealth, passed down or accumulated, is a key ingredient in breaking cycles of intergenerational poverty and lack of opportunity.
Which implies that current policies might be missing the mark. Things like Pell Grants focus on income, right? Help them pay tuition now.
Right. They help with affordability at the point of payment, which is important. But they don't replicate that background financial security, that long-term safety net that family wealth provides. They don't address the wealth gap itself.
So if the problem is a lack of wealth acting as a barrier, the policy solutions should focus on building wealth.
That's the argument. Instead of just income support, focus on policies that help low and middle income families build assets specifically for education or other long-term goals.
Like reforming existing savings plans. You mentioned 529 college savings plans mostly benefit the wealthy.
Yeah, because you need existing money to contribute, and the tax benefits favor higher earners. So the policy ideas involve redesigning these. Maybe give every child a baby bond or an initial deposit into a dedicated savings account at birth.
A government-seeded account.
Yes. And then for low-income families, offer generous government matches on their contributions. Maybe match dollar for dollar or even multiple dollars for every dollar they manage to save up to a certain limit.
So you're directly building that wealth cushion, providing that security, and signaling from an early age that college savings are happening, that it's an expected path.
Exactly. It tackles the wealth barrier head-on rather than just trying to patch over the income gaps later.
Okay, one related topic often comes up in these redistribution debates. Universal Basic Income, UBI. How does that fit in? Is it a solution to inequality and mobility issues?
UBI is definitely part of the conversation, but it's important to be really clear about what we mean. There are very different proposals floating around.
What's the key distinction?
A true UBI is completely unconditional. Every single adult gets a regular payment, say $1,000 a month, no strings attached, no matter if they work or not, no means test.
Okay, pure UBI. What's the alternative? Often confused with it.
That's usually a negative income tax, or NIT. And the NIT is also a form of basic income, but it's conditional. It phases out as your earned income goes up. So it targets support more towards lower earners and maintains a stronger incentive to work compared to a pure UBI.
And the cost difference must be huge.
Astronomical for a true UBI. One estimate for giving just $10,000 a year to every U.S. adult was nearly $2.5 trillion annually. That's over 12% of GDP. Just massive.
Requiring far more revenue than even the proposed billionaire tax could generate.
Oh, orders of magnitude more. The NIT proposals are cheaper, maybe in the $1.2 to $1.6 trillion range because they target the payments, but still incredibly expensive.
And beyond the cost, there's the persistent economic concern about UBI, isn't there? The impact on work.
Yes, that's been the central debate around basic income for decades. Both economic theory and most empirical studies, like the negative income tax experiments done in the US and Canada, suggest that giving people unconditional cash does lead to some reduction in work hours or labor force participation.
People work less if they get free money. Seems intuitive.
The size of the effect is debated, but the direction isn't really in doubt. And that creates a philosophical hurdle for many policymakers, especially if the goal is a pro-work, pro-skills agenda to combat declining employment rates among certain groups.
So NIT tries to mitigate that by keeping the phase-out rate low, preserving the incentive to earn more.
Right. Whereas the proponents of true UBI often see decoupling income from labor as a feature, not a bug, especially looking ahead to potential automation displacing jobs. But that's a much more radical vision than just poverty reduction via an NIT.
Okay, we've really covered a lot of ground here, from the stark numbers on wealth concentration and low tax rates,
To the detailed mechanics and feasibility of a global minimum wealth tax.
then weighing the deep philosophical arguments for and against allowing such extreme wealth accumulation.
And finally, looking at the real-world consequences for social mobility and how different policy ideas like wealth building or UBI try to address that.
It feels like the core tension really boils down to two things. On one hand, you have this clear evidence of a structural flaw in the tax system, where the very wealthiest legally pay less relative to their means than the middle class. That makes a strong case for something like Zuckman's 2% tax, purely on fairness and social cohesion grounds.
But on the other hand, you have the serious warning from market proponents. Be careful about taxing productive capital too heavily. You risk damaging the innovation engine, the goose that lays the golden eggs of cheaper goods, new technologies, and ultimately, maybe rising living standards for everyone.
It's not just about revenue, is it? It really hits the heart of what kind of society we want, the balance between democratic equality, economic dynamism, and opportunity.
It really forces you, the listener, to grapple with the fundamental trade-off. History shows tax systems change dramatically over time, so big reforms are possible. But the provocative question is, can a modern, advanced economy sustain high and rising living standards for the average person? Can it foster the kind of innovation we rely on without generating large-scale wealth concentration and, yes, billionaires?
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
You pointed out earlier that even countries we think of as highly egalitarian, like Sweden,
Right. Sweden, often held up as a model of social democracy and equality, actually has more billionaires per capita than the United States.
more per capita than the U.S.
Oh. It suggests that the kind of dynamic, market-driven prosperity that leads to high average incomes might almost inevitably produce these extreme outcomes at the top. The question is whether that's a necessary side effect we tolerate or even encourage for the sake of broader prosperity.
Or if we can find ways to impose stricter boundaries on that concentration through taxes or other means, without killing the economic dynamism that ultimately benefits society as a whole.
That's the tightrope walk. Is extreme wealth a bug to be fixed, or a feature, maybe even a necessary feature, of the system that generates widespread prosperity? A tough question with no easy answer.
Definitely something to mull over. We encourage you to subscribe, like, and comment to continue exploring these complex topics with us.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.